Welcome to episode 81 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. For anyone who is not familiar with our podcast, please visit EpicureanFriends.com. If you have any questions about the podcast, please be sure to contact us at the forum for more information. In this episode 81, we'll start at approximately Latin line 1350 of Book 5, and we'll go through the end of the book. Now let's join Martin reading today's text.
Their garments were skins of beasts, pinned together with thorns before they had learned to weave. The art of weaving came in after the discovery of iron, for their tools were made of that metal. Nor could the smooth treadles, the spindles, the shittles, and the rattling beams be formed any other way. But nature at first compelled the men to cart and spin, before the women undertook the trade. For men by far exceed the other sex in the invention of arts, and work with greater skill. The sturdy peasants at length reproached these male spinsters, and obliged them to give up the business into the women's hands. And then they betook themselves to more laborious employments, and hardened their limbs, and their hands with rougher work. But nature herself, the great mother of all things, first taught men to sow and to graft. For the berries and the acorns that fell from the trees, they observed, produced young shoots underneath in a proper season of the year. And hence they began to graft fruitful slips into boughs, and to plant young stalks over all the fields. Then they tried every other art to improve the kindly soil, and they found the wild fruits grew sweet and large by enriching the earth, and dressing it with great care. They employed themselves continually in reducing the woods to narrow bounds upon the hills, and to cultivate the lower places for corn and fruits. Thus they had the benefit of meadows, of lakes, of rivers, of cornfields, and pleasant vineyards upon the side of the hills, and in the dales, and of green rows of olives regularly running upon the rising grounds, and in the valleys, and spread all over the plains. As you see our country farms now laid out in all the variety of beauty, where the sweet apples are intermixed and adorn the scene, and fruitful trees are delightfully planted around all the fields. And men attempted to imitate by the mouth the charming voice of birds, before they tried to sing or to delight the ear with tuneful verse. And the soft murmurs of the reeds, moved by a gentle gale, first taught them how to blow the hollow reed, and by degrees to learn the tender notes, such as the pipe, by nimble fingers pressed, sends out when sweetly sung to, the pipe that now is heard in all the woods and groves, and all the lawns where shepherds take their solitary walks, and spend their days in innocence and ease. Thus time by degrees draws everything into use, and skill and ingenuity raise it to perfection. Thus music softened and relieved the minds of these rude swains after their rural feasts. For then the hearts at ease, and then they sweetly indulge their bodies, as they lie together on the soft grass, hard by a riverside, under the boughs of some high tree, without a heap of wealth. Chiefly when the spring smiles, and the season of the year sprinkles the verdant herbs with flowery pride. Then jest and smart conceits, and the loud laugh went round. And then the rustic music sung out, and gay and jocund in their sports, they crowned their heads, and on their shoulders hung garlands of flowers and leaves, and with unequal steps they rudely moved their limbs, and shook their mother earth with their hard feet. And then the laugh began, and pleasant grin, at these strange gambols, never seen before. And thus they kept awake, and, as refreshed by comfortable sleep, they spent the night in trolling country songs, and making mouths to many an awkward tune, and running over the reeds with crooked lip. These are the pleasures now our wanton youth pursue, who sit up all the night. They learn to dance in measure, but receive no more delight than did that rustic race of earthborn swains so long ago. For while we know better and enjoy a present good, it wonderfully pleases and delights us above all things. But when we discover something more agreeable, this destroys and changes the relish of what went before. So acorns became odious to the palate, and the beds of grass and leaves were laid aside, and skins went out of use, and that savage sort of clothing was despised. And yet, I think, he that first wore it raised such envy to himself that he was treacherously slain. He was torn to pieces, and his leathern garments stained with his own blood, nor was he suffered to enjoy the fruit of his own invention. At that time men fought for skins, but now gold and purple employs their cares, and set them together by the ears. And I think we are much more to blame of the two. For without the use of skins, the cold would have been very grievous to those earthborn wretches, but we suffer nothing if we go without purple or clothes of gold, embroidered in the richest figures, since a meaner dress would as well secure us against the cold. Wretched, therefore, and vain are the troubles of mankind. They spend their whole life in the pursuit of empty cares, and no wonder, since they fix no limit to what they possess, and know nothing how far the bounds of true pleasure may extend. And this ignorance carries them by degrees into a sea of evils, and raises the most violent storms of war throughout the world. But the wakeful sun and moon, surveying with their light the great and rolling skies, have taught men that the seasons of the year are turned about, and that things are carried on by certain rules and in a fixed order. And now mankind enclosed themselves and lived in castles. The lands were parted out, and each enjoyed his own. The sea was sailed over by crewed ships, and men joined together for defense and formed alliances by certain bonds. So poets then began to celebrate in verse the great exploits, and letters were not long before discovered. What was transacted many ages past, those times knew nothing of, but what their reason darkly traced out. Use, therefore, and the experience of an inquiring mind led men by degrees into the knowledge of navigation, of agriculture, taught them to build walls, to make laws, arms, public ways, garments, and other things of the same nature, made them acquainted with poetry, painting, and statuary. Thus time gradually produces everything into use, and reason shows it in a clear light. One art, we observe, is refined and polished by another, till they arrive at the highest point of perfection.
Martin, thank you for reading that today. We've arrived at the highest point of perfection and also the end of book 5 with your reading that for us today. A little bit longer than normal text, but it does end book 5 for us, so it's a good one to try to do all at one time today if we possibly can.
Did you pay attention to the reading? I think I corrected 3 times, so to say, autocorrect while reading. What was it?
I saw that too. Well done.
So it was correct. These corrections I made were actual corrections to be made. No?
Correct. Yep. That's the way I would have read it. So, yep.
Unfortunately, I didn't make as many notes there as I should have because I was consumed. I wanted to come to your defense, Martin, and make sure that everybody understood that when you read the first paragraph and talked about the implements of weaving, that we were talking about treadles, spindles, and in fact, the 1743 edition does say the shittles. I was sure that after I heard you say that it must be shuttles, but no, unless it's a typo in the 1743, then the shittle is what it refers to there as one of the implements of weaving, it looks like. So I guess if we start back in that first paragraph we're talking about, and I don't want to make it into a discussion of the technology of weaving, but I've, in my own experience, heard the word carding over the years and never really understood what that meant. Martin, have you heard the word card in relation to weaving or textiles?
This is the first time that I read this. Actually, my great-great-grandfather was a weaver, but of course that's too long ago that I carry on any of that knowledge.
Yeah, that's one of those things about having lost the knowledge of really turning cotton and so forth into thread and then weaving it and so forth. But the textile plants around the area where I've lived in much of my life, I would hear people talk about, I worked in the card room. And it always used to seem to me, well, you guys must have played a lot of rummy and poker and so forth. But apparently a card is one of the first things you do with the fibers of animal.
Like wool and things like that. I believe what it is if it's whenever you initially have a wad of wool and you have 2 cards with little pins on them and you do them back and forth to straighten out the threads in the natural fiber.
It's something like combing then.
Right. Yeah, I found it interesting here with his thing about the weaving and the knotted garments. I thought was interesting because I thought that that's if you knot together different things that makes sense that would come first. But weaving itself goes back. I mean, I was seeing things like 10,000 years ago, that sort of thing, and you see vertical looms with it just have weights hanging on the bottom that other cultures have used in early days and ancient cultures used. So the whole idea of having the kneading the treadles and the spindles and the shittles and the beams and stuff. I mean, it's definitely, it seems like he's using the idea that weaving as it existed in his time was how it started, and that's obviously not the way it started. So, I mean, you don't need a lot of that iron technology to start weaving things.
With tens of years, that means that was even before bronze. That means there were no metal parts available then. It must have been by wood, bone, or stone, no?
Exactly, yeah. They're like heavy stones hanging from the threads, and so that they stayed vertical, and then you could weave in among them.
Okay, well, now that we've finished talking about the technology of weaving, we can probably just skip right over this next section that talks about how men work harder than women. But I suspect that some of the readers or listeners would like to hear us talk about that. So who would like to jump on the question of how nature first compelled men to card and spin before women undertook the trade? For men by far exceed the other sex in the invention of arts and work with greater skill. Who wants to attack that one first?
I'll wade into the water. I think I posted something on the forum saying I couldn't decide whether he was being misogynistic or whether he was being satirical, because I could see it going either way. And he's addressing sort of the stereotypical view prevalent in his time. And I'm like, well, are you being serious? The thing that strikes me is that throughout Epicurus's writings and the other parts of the Lucretius's poem, that the sexes are seen as much more equal and much more worthy of respect than they were in any other sort of context in the ancient world, it seems to me. And the fact that he just sort of throws this in here almost as a non sequitur just seemed kind of odd to me.
Right. It doesn't seem to be essential to the narrative or really advance the proposition that much. So I have to wonder, too, if it's not as much something that he thought was sort of witty. I know that as we get down to what we have today as paragraph 1390, when he talks about what the rustic people used to do out in the fields, he says that, and then jests and smart conceits and the loud laugh went round. And I have to wonder in my own mind if he's not potentially smiling or realizing the significance of what he's saying when he says this.
And even the whole idea that the farmers were the ones that made fun of the men who were weaving, there would be no reason to make fun of them for weaving if it wasn't already considered work that women had done in the first place. And it just the whole structure of that little paragraph just doesn't really make a lot of sense if you try and look at it as a indictment of the weaving trade, because weaving was so important to everything they did.
I think this is again a speculation on part of Lucretius, because like you mentioned, this weaving was invented long time before. And then he just by inference he just thought this up. So it's not that he really knew this. It's just something that he thought it was like that.
And I have to wonder too if he didn't throw it in there, since I mean he's nominally dedicating the poem to Memmius. You know, is he throwing this as a bone to Memmius? Like, oh yeah, men are so much more better at coming up with things, and you know that's sort of placating his supposed quote unquote audience.
Right.
Actually, in the past, there may have been something in it. I mean, I wouldn't say completely, but typically women would get married at a younger age than men. And they would practically immediately get pregnant and then have to take care of kids. If you take care of kids, you tend to become more conservative, typically. So you stick to what is known and to apply this. And if then you see that husband, instead of working hard, he's just playing around, then this is something women at that time would imagine now would not like. And similarly also today, when men do more on leisure than the women likes them to do. And this is what you need to do in invention, so that you have time to think about and play around and try out. So that means that under the condition of actual living condition of men and women, and the differences which were imposed by what was practiced in society, it appears to me logical that in the past men were more likely to make inventions.
So I've also heard that women would have come up with weaving and things like that because they needed bags and baskets and things like that to whenever they were doing the gathering of plants and berries and things like that. They needed something to put them in, so it was a logical extension for them to come up with ways to carry more things back to the camp whenever they were out in the fields.
And then the last sentence makes reference to the obvious point as well when it says that the sturdy peasants and obliged them to, and they betook themselves to more laborious employments and hardened their limbs and their hands with rougher work. I mean, there's certainly the physical aspect of things that men are in general more able to do harder.
Yeah, and oddly enough, the word used right there in the Latin is agricolae, and so it's literally the farmers were the ones that made fun of the men that were weaving. So I find it interesting that that they're literally talking about the people that tilled the earth were like, come on out here and work with us. We're doing the manly work.
Yeah, yeah. I guess that's part of the old ways of looking at things like the mountain versus the hill people and the farmers versus the weavers. I get this impression, what's a tanner? A tanner is somebody who takes leather, right?
Right,
And makes clothing out of that. I remember reading some of the references to the excavations in Pompeii and Herculaneum, and it seems like several of the buildings were like tanners or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Where
to produce leather, they produce leather from the animals.
Okay, well, if we move to the next paragraph, nature herself, the mother of all things, taught. It sounds like we're going to go into farming here,
which is not as much of a bullet point change as what Lucretius has done in the past, since he at least says that the farmers told the men to come out and work in the fields and make themselves sturdy and that sort of thing. And now it's like we're moving into the actual agricultural sorts of stuff.
Right. They found that the fruits would grow sweeter and larger by enriching the earth and dressing it with greater care. He's very pleased with the outcome of how, and you see our country farms now laid out in all the variety of beauty, where the sweet apples are intermixed and adorn the scene, and fruitful trees are delightfully planted around all the fields. In fact, if I remember correctly from Diogenes Laertius, it's a very short reference, but it says something about Epicurus saying that the wise man will be fond of the country.
Right.
So to some extent, this may be a reflection of that part as well.
That's one of my favorite words in that whole 10th book of Diogenes, is that it's one word. To love the country is one word. Philoagrain, I believe, is what it is. To love the field.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
I haven't heard of that.
It's only one word in the Greek.
In hindsight, I'm really upset about how agriculture has gone, because 70 years ago it was still like that in Germany. I mean, I can talk only about Germany because I won't have the hearsay from other countries. So we had apple trees all over the countryside. When the kids were roaming around, if they were hungry, they could just pull an apple. And these trees have all been cut about 60 years ago.
Oh, wow. Well, there's the, in the United States, at least, Cassius will know this about the legend of, well, it's not a legend. Johnny Appleseed went into the western areas of the early United States and planted apple orchards for the settlers that were going to be coming afterwards.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good point. I've always read that. Is there any residue of that still around that you know of, Don?
I would assume so. I don't know for sure, but I think, from what I remember, he planted, just acres and acres of them. So there has to be at least a few that are left over. He was a weird guy, though. I would encourage people to Wikipedia him, and he had some weird things going on.
I guess related to the same issue. Don, this is something that you may know. What is Georgics? Isn't Georgics supposed to be about the attractiveness of the agricultural life or something like that?
I believe so, yeah.
It sounds like the Romans during that period, which would be fairly close to when Lucretius was writing, were interested in encouraging agriculture, encouraging people.
Yeah, the Georgics are and I'm going to defer to Wikipedia here. As the name suggests, from the Greek word georgica, which would probably in English butcher as Georgica, are agricultural things. So the subject of the poem is agricultural.
Well, that's what always struck me is I never could associate the word George in my mind with agriculture. So when I hear the word Georgics as an extremely famous Roman poem, it never evokes any meaning when I hear that term. So I didn't realize that till just now. So Georgics is a reference to agriculture.
Yep, from the Greek.
Okay, well, so we turn from agriculture to imitating the charming voice of birds and singing and playing reeds. I'm not sure what we can get out of that other than that's a nicely phrased paragraph.
Yeah, I think the fact that, I would go back to the whole thing about ataraxia and apnea, the tranquility and the pain, but also the joy and the, what are the two words that, the four words that are there with the, my mind is blanking, on the katastomatic and the static
kinetic
pleasures and the kinetic and the static pleasures, that this is definitely an endorsement here of the kinetic pleasures.
Right. And gets even more as we go through this in terms of dancing and singing and so forth. Yeah.
Exactly. Cannot conceive of pleasure without the pleasures of movement and the pleasures of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Sometimes it's irritating to me when I look from translation to translation and try and find an equivalent sentence. I was about to say that the last sentence here we have for 1379 sounds like it's kind of philosophical. Thus time by degrees draws everything into use, and skill and ingenuity raise it to perfection. So I cast my eye on the Bailey's translation, and I see nothing that looks like that. I don't know whether it's in Martin Ferguson Smith or not. No, I don't see that there either. I don't know where that comes from.
And what line were you looking at?
Well, the very last sentence we have there on 1379, right before 1390, it says, thus time by degrees draws everything into use. It certainly sounds like it was written there, but I don't see it in Martin Ferguson Smith either. So, and let me see if it's in Monroe. No.
Oh, interesting.
They might have omitted it because this point is again then mentioned at the very end.
I was just going to say the same thing. Yeah. Well, there's something that's transposed in one either translation or some manuscript copy.
Yes, I hope it wasn't transmuted by me when I was doing the typing. But I'm pretty sure let me look.
Well, if it was, you were just doing it as a demonstration of the problems that can arise over multiple centuries in different translations. So it was
yes. No, here it is on page 223 of the PDF of the 1743 edition. He just has that sentence right there in the middle of his paragraph, right before he says, thus music softened and relieved the minds of these rude swains.
Yeah, and I think the softening there, too, is reminiscent of some of the things that he's talked about in the past, too, where that whenever we, as humans, were originally made out of the earth, that we were rugged and lived a hard life, and then as we moved into doing agriculture and moved into civilizations, that it softened us and we took care of our children and all that sort of thing. So it seems to echo that sort of idea of the softening, and the softening is not as a negative thing either.
Right. It doesn't have a negative connotation necessarily.
Exactly. Which is interesting because if you go back to the earlier paragraph about talking about, the manly men getting out into the field and making their hands rough and doing the manly work and, that sort of thing, it's almost a juxtaposed against that.
Right. And so as we go into this, what we have is paragraph 1390. This one really just emphasizes to me what you said earlier, Don, about how this one's devoted to the music and gay and jocund and their sports and crowning their heads and hung garlands of flowers and leaves and then basically dancing and so forth. This is clearly a kinetic activity. It's certainly an emotion that goes along with the joy and delight phrase that you see Diogenes Laertius say that Epicurus embraced both kinds of pleasure, not just
exactly
the other kind.
I find it interesting. The one word that jumps out at me was that these are the pleasures now our wanton youth pursue. The word wanton has sort of a negative connotation, but I don't get an idea that he has a negative connotation of these activities just from the way that he's rhapsodizing about them in the rest of the paragraph.
But so I think it's a pun against that used in indulging in this, because he puts them on the level of rude swains.
Okay, I'll go with that.
Again, I'm looking for that one in Bailey or Monroe, and I don't see it. Well, now, Monroe does have, whence even at the present day, watchmen observe these traditions and have lately learned to keep the proper tune, and yet for all this receive not a jot more of enjoyment than the rugged race of sons of earth received. So, yes, that's an equivalent, but it doesn't refer to our wanton youth pursue. So,
yeah, I see the watchmen in the Loeb translation too, interesting enough. Whence even now the watchmen keep up the tradition, and they have learnt how to keep the various kinds of rhythms. Yet for all that they have no more profit and enjoyment than the woodland people who were born of the earth.
Watchman. I'm not familiar with that word. I don't get it from you.
I don't understand either where the watchman. That's an interesting choice of words.
Yeah, actually, it sounds more like the 1743 might be actually correct, because he's talking about people who stay up all night who learn to dance in measure. So a watchman or a night watchman or gatekeeper or whatever would not normally be staying up late to learn to dance. I wonder if we could find the Latin quickly enough to figure that out. We'd have to go to Loeb.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Loeb translation, trying to figure out which line it is here.
It looks like it's right before 1412.
Okay. So it looks like it is vigiles or vigiles, if you use the V pronunciation, because that one gives you those awake or on watch, a watchman or sentinel, Of such vigils there were in Rome from the time of Augustus, 7 divisions with their prefects and subprefects, constituting a regularly organized night police. So you're right. So it does seem to be talking about the night watch. So why would the night watchman keep up the tradition of dancing? Unless they're doing it under cover of darkness.
No, to keep awake, I think.
Oh, I will accept that. Yeah, okay.
That's at least an effort. Yeah.
Although
it doesn't really, or maybe that's why they.
I've heard of people who are really into this. So they say they can go 4 nights in a row by doing this partying. No? So and apparently, so that really helps to keep awake.
Oh, there you okay. That's as good of a idea as I've heard yet. And I find it interesting that they have learned how to keep the various kinds of rhythm with it. So the watchmen have learned to keep the various kinds of rhythm. Yet for all that, they have no more profit and enjoyment than the woodland people who were born of the earth. So what he's saying there is that the current people who are dancing the dances and singing the songs are getting as much enjoyment out of it as we did whenever we were living in the woods and just coming into civilization, which sort of gives, at least to my eye, the continuity that those are natural pleasures that should be enjoyed, and they can be enjoyed in the far past or even in what he's talking about as the present.
Yeah, that's clearly got to be the main point of this whole section here, this reference, that just because we may have more technology or more money or nicer clothing or things like that, we don't get any more enjoyment out of the basic things of life than somebody who's 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago enjoying the same things that we might not get as much.
And I give Martin the kudos for coming up with the staying awake with the dancing. That's the interpretation I'm going with.
Yeah, now I don't dispute that, but I would have thought that now this is something else I associate with Martin and the Germans, but I'm thinking about marching. Maybe if you're a watchman, maybe you stay awake by, what do you call,
cadences?
not cadences or just when you're patrolling
I don't know, but I've been told.
Yeah, that's true. That's true too. Okay, well, we probably ought to move on. But now that I have my Loeb edition out in front of me, I want to come to the defense of the 1743 translation and say that sentence that I couldn't find is right there in Loeb, but with brackets around it. So by degrees, time brings up before us every single thing, and reason lifts it into the precincts of light. So the fact that the Loeb edition has that in brackets right before line 1390 at least gives us some confidence that the 1743 translator didn't just invent things more than necessary.
Oh, I see that as well. I see the brackets now. Yeah.
But it's often inserted there. I mean, if you take it out, the sentence before and the first sentence of the next paragraph just go smoothly on the same theme.
Yes.
And the sentence is basically an interruption of that line of song.
Yeah. So it's got to be one of those situations Don mentioned where one of the manuscripts must have somehow got that in the middle there, and everybody after that nowadays considers it to be a transcription error. And if they include it, they mark it with brackets or footnotes, something like that. But it must have made it into one of the transcriptions somewhere.
And it is, if you look at the Loeb translation, that second sentence at the very end of the book is an exact transcription of that part that's in the brackets.
Exact, huh?
So, well, let me read. You look at the one on 1389, and let me read the one that's at the end of the book, and you tell me if it's the same, because I can't keep flipping pages back and forth very well. So the one at the very end of the book is, so by degrees time brings up before us every single thing, and reason lifts it into the precincts of light.
Well, now that maybe we're looking at different Loeb editions, but my final sentence of the Loeb edition says, "For they saw one thing after another."
The sentence right before that. I'm sorry. The second to last sentence. The penultimate sentence.
Yes. You're right. That is exactly the same sentence.
So I could very easily see somebody transcribing this and flipping pages and forgetting to flip them on the other side or something, and that would be a transcription error.
Yeah. Having those two sentences right together at the end of the book almost looks like it's redundant, because those two sentences are pretty closely related, it seems like. Okay, well, maybe we should move on to get to that point, but that's interesting. All right, so where are we?
So we're checking off. It's okay to enjoy kinetic pleasures. Check.
Yes, and that's a huge check right there. And then we go back in 1412 to talking about how our observation and our appreciation of things doesn't always last, and how, in fact, can deteriorate even though we're able to appreciate some of these simpler and more basic pleasures. We get tired of it, like acorns. Mm-hmm. So acorns became odious to the palate, and the beds of grass and leaves were laid aside, and skins went out of use, and savage sort of clothing was despised. And in fact, he goes on, this is an interesting part about it, how even the very first person who developed that was torn to pieces treacherously by his, I wouldn't call them friends, but his associates, who stole his leather garment and stained with his own blood. And how now even we don't fight for skins anymore, but for gold. And of course, purple is always a reference, I guess, within the Roman context to power, indications of power.
And I think it's interesting that next sentence there, right there, is and I think we are much more to blame of the two. So he's actually saying that he could at least understand somebody trying to steal somebody's garment, back whenever we lived in the fields and were, not everybody knew how to make clothing. And if somebody had something that was going to keep them warmer, that they would kill the person and take it from them because it would keep them warmer. But now the idea of the gold and the purple, we don't need those to stay warm, and it seems superfluous to fight over things like that.
Right. And then this next sentence after that is probably a very good summary of one of the main points too. Wretched, therefore, and vain are the troubles of mankind. They spend their whole life in pursuit of empty cares. And no wonder, since they fix no limit to what they possess, and they know nothing how far the bounds of true pleasure may extend. And this ignorance carries them by degrees into a sea of evils and raises the most violent storms of war throughout the world. That's a very good summary of one of these major points of Epicurean philosophy, which I think we probably bear repeating. Does not necessarily mean that we aim to live in the cave at the lowest possible subsistence level, but that we don't have to be rich and powerful and glamorous and have all sorts of fame in order to be happy.
Yeah, and the whole idea that, with the fixing no limit, the whole idea that I get from that and from other texts as well is that there is no limit to power. You can always have more power. And more power and more power. And if you strive for that, you're never going to be satisfied.
Yeah, and life itself, if we spend our time obsessing over the fact that we're not immortal, that we're going to die at some point, then we're reaching for something that just to say that you'd like to live another day has no end to it. So that's why it's important to think about what life is about and how you don't need an unlimited time in order to achieve what is appropriate for a human to achieve.
Because if you're always looking for tomorrow, you never concentrate on what's going on today.
Right. They fix no limit to what they possess, and they know nothing how far the bounds of true pleasure may extend. That's said a little bit differently, but I think it's basically the same issue, that you have to identify mentally the appropriate amount. And in order to identify the appropriate amount, you have to decide what the goal of what you're doing is.
Right.
It's not possessions in themselves, and that is the important thing. It is pleasure and being alive to experience pleasure that's the important thing.
Yeah, if you're always striving for something you don't have, you can never be satisfied with what you do have.
Just as a dictionary definition of the issue, yes.
Right.
You're locking yourself into eternal frustration.
There you go. Exactly. Yeah. Well put.
Because the things you don't have, you'll never have by definition.
And is it a Vatican saying or a fragment that's, the things that you have are the things that you did wish for at one time?
Right. I think that's a Vatican saying. It's pretty easy to understand, or for us to think we understand what he means when he says they fix no limit to what they possess. But the second phrase, again, strikes me as the more important or intricate of the two. They know nothing how far the bounds of true pleasure may extend. That's not the way that most people in the world today generally evaluate the question. It seems to me that they look at just simply how much money do you have, and they kind of stop at that analysis. But in terms of discussing how far the bounds of true pleasure may extend, that's the more difficult part, I think.
I thought an interesting, the Loeb translation has an interesting take on those lines, and they go, therefore mankind labors always in vain and to no purpose, consuming its days in empty cares, plainly because it does not know the limit of possession and how far it is ever possible for real pleasure to grow. And this, little by little, has carried life out into the deep sea and has stirred up from the bottom the great billows of war.
Yeah,
that phrase, does not know the limit of possession, I think is an interesting way to phrase that, because it's like if you think you can accumulate infinite power and you're always striving for that, or infinite wealth, or infinite, whatever, you can only possess so much.
Or even the fact of the limit of the meaning of what it means to possess something, because you got the standard observation that you can't take it with you. So you may think that you possess your computer or your land or your money or whatever, but really it's just something you've got temporary possession of because you're not going to have it forever.
Right.
Okay, we probably ought to plow on to the end here. And the wakeful sun and moon taught men that the seasons of the year are turned around. And then mankind enclosed themselves and lived in castles and parted out the land to each other. And the sails.
Well, I think it's interesting that very last line there that you sort of skipped over there with the certain rules in fixed order goes back to so much stuff that he's already mentioned in the previous parts of the poem too. That there is a fixed order to the universe, and there's nobody in charge of it, but that's just the way things are.
Yeah, you're definitely right. I shouldn't have skipped over that. The observation that things exist in a certain rule and in a fixed order. That's one of the things to keep in mind as we talk about the swerve and the free will aspect of Epicurus, is that while the swerve exists, while people have a certain agency over things, there are certain rules and a fixed order that governs an awful lot of the universe, the majority of the universe, basically, which we can deduce by just simply looking at the sun and the moon and realizing that things do continue on year after year in the same sequence.
So I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Please go ahead.
Well, I was looking for another stopping point, so that was a good place to stop there. Because then 1440 continues to talk about the developments of things, that how the sea was sailed over by ships and men joined together for defense and formed alliances by certain bonds, except, of course, the Epicureans, who all stayed alone in their caves and never had any alliances or contracts at all. Let's always keep that in mind for those modern interpreters of Epicurus who think that that's what Epicurus required. Then the poets began to celebrate the great exploits, and letters were not long before discovered. And then what was transacted many ages past, these times knew nothing of, but what their reason darkly traced out. So I would say that's kind of an admission of the speculative nature of some of what
I was going to say exactly the same thing. Yep, exactly the same thing.
And it's strange that both the Browne and Bailey translate the letters were discovered, whereas Mangus has correctly invented. So is there any ambiguity in the Latin between discovering and inventing?
That's a very good point. It certainly question. What's the Latin word there? It's going to be at the end of 1440. You see anything, Don?
I'm looking here. So it should be right before 1448. Repair, I think at the end of line 1445.
The reperta?
Reperta is defined as to find again, find, meet with, find out, discover.
Okay. Reperta then would be the word to focus on. So perta, what does perta mean? Re means they did it again, presumably, but what does perta mean?
Yeah, according to the dictionary definition here, we have to procure or find again, find, to meet with, find out, either by searching or by accident.
Then that tends more towards discovery rather than invention.
Right.
This is quite interesting because in some ways the Chinese characters were discovered, so to say, because from what I read, the origin of this Chinese letter system is that the priests would do oracles on the turtle shells put in fire. So they would crack, and from these cracks they try to predict the future. And then from these crack patterns, they developed the script. So in that sense, the Chinese letters were discovered.
Oh, yeah. Well, down here on the second line of the definitions, it also has to find out, hit upon, invent, devise, or discover. So invent and discover are literally in the same definition line. So, yeah, it looks like it has to do with the with the grammar of the way it's used in the sentence too. So it looks like it can actually do both devise and discover. But I like your idea of how things can both be discovered and invented.
Mm-hmm.
Because it would not be probably appropriate to say that if we're talking about letters being discovered and we're talking about the art of writing and reading,
Mm-hmm.
that's not something that, well, invented versus discovered. I would say that's more invented, right?
Well, I
Yes.
mean, you also. Oh, go ahead, Barton.
Yeah, I mean, normally, yes, except for this case where, like this Chinese script, no? So, that is then the question: what is the real origin of the Latin or Greek? Because when they also have earlier examples, I think they've been developed of the Sumerian script, no? But the question is then, how did this Sumerian script arise?
I think it also goes back too to his talk about the origins of language too. That language started out rudimentary with sounds that everybody sort of agreed on, and then it developed into actual spoken language. And so was that discovered or was it invented? I mean, it seems like there's a little aspect of both, even in the origin of language itself.
Yes, in some way, yes, but I would say it's predominantly invented.
I would agree. I think to formalize it and to codify it and to actually, if we start talking about grammar and syntax and those things have to be invented. You can have sort of natural things that feed into them, but there has to be some sort of rules and fixed order to actually codify the language itself. In the same way with writing systems.
You can discover what kind of sounds you can do with your voice, no? But then
Right.
to give to the sounds, this is rather more an invention.
Right. I would agree. Yeah, I would agree. That's a good way to put it.
And I would say if we're keeping our traditional enemies in mind, the important point would be to say that God did not give us writing or language, nor is there a dimension of ideal forms that Plato has, that these things were just existing out in the universe until we somehow, through the use of geometry, discovered them through the use of geometry. And so that's the issue. I guess that is the issue that we're talking about here, is in trying to fine tune discovery versus invention. It's not something that was just, the art of writing in Latin or any language, or the art of speaking in Latin or any language was not floating out in space somewhere waiting for a discoverer to open the first grammar book. It's something that had to be developed. Okay. With that, let's go to the very last passage we have for today.
Dun, 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 dun.
Yes, indeed. And for book 5. So here at the end of book 5, we've come to the conclusion that use, therefore, and the experience of an inquiring mind led men by degrees into the knowledge of navigation, of agriculture, taught them to build walls, to make laws, arms, public ways, garments, and that's kind of an interesting list of things, and other things of the same nature, and made them acquainted with poetry, painting, and statuary. Thus time gradually produces everything into use, and reason shows it in a clear light. One art we observed is refined and polished by another till they arrive at the highest point of perfection. How is that the conclusion of book 5?
Well, I think you hit on part of it with the experience of an inquiring mind shows that there were no gods that gave us agriculture or taught us how to build walls, or no gods that gave us laws. It was all through the human intellect and human reasoning and human invention that these things came about.
Yeah, I do think I'm going back to the beginning of book 5 to see where we started and try to glance at some of the topics that we covered. But basically, that has been the development of book 5, I think. This is sort of the rise of humanity from the beginning of the book to the end. And probably one of the big, super important points he wants to emphasize, that this rise of humanity has not come from the gods or come from any kind of divine guidance whatsoever, or any other kind of fate, if that were divine. It's just at least with humans, it's the experience of the inquiring mind, the actual events that occurred leading from one to another.
Yeah.
And I don't want to forget this part that I raised in a note this past week either. This one is also where the reference is made to the borders or the shores of light. Mm-hmm. The Monroe version says, thus time by degrees brings each several thing before men's eyes, and reason raises it up into the borders of light. And then Bailey says, so little by little time brings out each several thing into view, and reason raises it up into the coast of light. So presuming that Bailey and Monroe both are being the most literal here, there's this reference to the coasts or the shores of light that I think we've seen before in the book, which strikes me as an interesting analogy that's probably meant something to the Epicureans.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk in the Epicureans too. I think about, safe harbors and calm seas and that sort of thing. So this is an extension of that, I think.
Right, that's right.
Yeah, the Latin there is in luminis erigit oras, and the oras is the one that's in the which is an extremity, border, the brim, the edge, the margin, the boundary, the limit. So it's before it was in darkness, and now it's brought into the light, and you can actually work with it. And if you can see it and work with it, then it can be used, as he says, one art sharpens another, basically.
Looking at, I've got the Bailey in front of me now, where it says, thus time by degrees brings each several thing forth before men's eyes. And I'm presuming that it's very possible that before men's, although I don't see it yet, it's very possible before men's eyes would be ante oculos, which is always a phrase that sticks in my mind as being a part of the opening of book 1 when he first starts talking about Epicurus, because the little part of this that I've memorized over the years is that passage starts humana ante oculos. I always tried to reason out how to translate humana ante oculos. But at any rate, I wonder if that's potentially an echo of that. But I don't see.
This is probably way too in the weeds, and we don't have to go too far down this. But you bringing up that ante oculos, I think, is interesting, because in reading some of the things about the Philodemus's writings, that he talks about the exercise of bringing things before the eyes. To if you're trying to control your anger, that you imagine what it's like to be angry in the situation, and you bring it before your eyes, and you can assess it in a more reasoned way. I was not aware of the Latin phrase, so that's kind of interesting.
I think that's got to be some kind of an Epicurean idiom as well, because before eyes could presumably be translated, or presumably means clearly or obviously or something like that. And it would pretty clearly be a hint back at the standard of proof of things, because that's such a big important aspect of Epicurean philosophy. There is no higher standard of proof than to be basically right in front of you for your eyes and your other sense faculties to be able to sense. For things must be brought to light one after the other and in due order in the different arts until these have reached their highest point of development. That's Monroe, and Bailey says, actually, Bailey makes it more specific by saying, he makes it kind of historical by saying, for they saw one thing after another grow clear in their mind until by their arts they reached the topmost pinnacle. That's pretty different than what Monroe has. Monroe's making a more generic philosophical statement when he says, for things must be brought to light one after the other. That would be one, especially since we're ending book 5, to decide which is. I think he's talking about the regular order of things, that you can't jump to weaving, before you have leather garments, and you can't, have music until you try to imitate the birds. And there's a regular progression of things that will work through to get to where you want to go. Yeah.
And of course, he's seeing Roman culture there as the topmost pinnacle too. So he's seeing his civilization as the best example so far that we've had. That he's using them as the exemplar of, look how far we've come, and look at all the things we have, and look at the agriculture and the ships and the navigation, and check us out, man.
Do you have any of the other versions, Don, convenient, like Stallings? I do think that you've raised some really good points about what these last two sentences mean, why they're not just sort of and this is the way it happened kind of a statement. It's much deeper than saying that.
So Stallings has the last two sentences as, so incrementally time brings all things within our sight, and reason lifts them up into the boundaries of light. For men saw one thing after another clearly in their hearts till they ascended to the very summit of the arts.
Well, now that really emphasizes what you just said about him being very pleased with the state of civilization at that particular point. And that could be part of it, or maybe it's all of it. I think the Monroe version, I guess, is what got me interested in whether it's more of a philosophic statement, because with things must be brought to light one after another and in due order until these have reached the highest point of development. That's more of a lesson as opposed to a history statement.
And interestingly enough, the very last word in the Latin for the book is cacumen, which is defined as an extremity, a point, the summit, the top. So I find it interesting that that's the last word, because I'm sure he knew what he wanted to end that book with. So he is stopping at the top, and it can be used for the summits of mountains or the points in the end of a blade of grass, and so he's literally the extreme top of whatever.
Right. And I'm looking at the Loeb edition, and I see that the Latin word right above cacumen, and what I'm looking at is videbant, which I presume means they saw. So the they saw structure is probably part of it here.
And the dictionary actually cites Lucretius chapter 211, lines 1130, and they give the Latin there, but then what it actually means is to the height of perfection. So that Latin was ad sumum dona venere cacumen, which is similar to what's at the end of Book 5, which is actually exactly what's at the end of Book 5, as a matter of fact. So,
okay. Okay, well,
so we've reached the height of perfection. All right.
And we've reached the height of perfection and the end of the book, and closing in on the end of the episode here. We're probably running actually slightly long today. So let's talk about anything you want to say to end the episode or to end Book 5. And we can go back and forth since we're at the end of the book, but we can start with Martin as usual.
Yeah, and as most of the time, I have nothing to add.
Okay.
As far as I'm concerned, we've had a lot of speculation in Book 5, a lot of maybe a little bit of revisionist history, some satire and some historical notes, but I think it's been interesting to see how Lucretius, and by extension, I would think some of the ancients, saw the way that things developed in their civilization and in civilization in general.
Right. Well, unfortunately, my eye falls on something that I want to add before we finish then. Here in the Loeb edition, there's a footnote going back to either the watchful sentinels or the wanton youth discussion we had earlier. I see that probably Smith, back in the original Loeb edition, cites a reference to Thomas Campbell, The Soldier's Dream, and he quotes, "And the sentinel stars set their watch in the sky." And he says the idea of calling the sun and the moon Vigilus Mundi was probably suggested by the mention of the human vigiles in 1408, in line 1408. And so that line has spurred significant comment and makes reference here in the Loeb edition to some other works to read as well. But at any rate, being vigilous is part of what we've talked about today. And does that mean vigilant, or does that mean something totally different? Surely it gave rise to vigilant, but whether it means exactly what we think it does, I would still, regardless of whether it actually means vigilant, say that the ending here is reminding us to be vigilant and remembering that things happen over time in a natural sequence of things. And not because of the will of gods or because of fate or because of chaos, really, but because there is a natural order that arises from the elemental particles and void, which form the basis of everything. Okay, so I hope I haven't wandered too far there at the very end. Does that spur any comment from anybody?
Yeah, looking forward to Book 6.
Right. Book 6 is going to start out in its normal, as each book starts out, in a very interesting ethical and sort of summary fashion. And then, unfortunately, we turn to the facts of death and destruction in the Plague of Athens. So we'll have at least 10 more weeks or 15 more weeks of episodes, and then we'll be needing to recap the whole book. It's good that we finished another one here at Book 5. I appreciate everybody's time, and we'll come back next week and start Book 6. So thanks.
All right.
All right. See you next week.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.